The date is July 19, 1943. The location is Rome, Italy. For years, the great sprawling arteries of the Italian railway system, the bridges, the tunnels, the marshalling yards, had pulsed with life, quietly sustaining Mussolini's grand, failing empire. The Italian war machine, dependent on coal and oil funneled from the north and German assistance, was a brittle thing, held together by sheer logistics. Yet for all the air raids directed at the industrial north, the capital, Rome, remained untouched. Protected by a delicate political truce, it stood as a symbolic shield, an impossible target. This was the great strategic paradox of the Mediterranean. The weakest link in the Axis chain was also the most sacred. The Allied strategists, weary of the grind in North Africa, looked north. They saw a brittle infrastructure, a population on the edge of despair, and a leader, Benito Mussolini, whose strut was quickly dissolving into panicked sweat. Sicily, the next logical step, was only as strong as its supply chain, and that chain led inevitably through the Italian mainland. The ultimate prize was not merely land, but a psychological and industrial fracture that would eliminate a major combatant, to knock Italy out of the war. The order was passed down from the highest echelons. The strategic bombing campaign against Italy was about to change, drastically. It would pivot from generalized attacks to a precise, brutal campaign of interdiction. The goal, total systemic collapse of Italian logistics. Enter the heavy bomber, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator, flown by the newly formidable U.S. 15th Air Force. These aircraft were monuments to American industrial might, designed for the vast, unforgiving skies of Europe. Each B-17 carried up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance. A single raid could drop the weight of a small warship onto a target. Before the first bomb could fall on the rail lines, the target analysis had to be flawless. Allied intelligence, aided by photographic reconnaissance from high-flying mosquitoes, began assembling what they termed the Italian Railway Target System. This wasn't about vaporizing cities, it was surgical destruction. The key was to hit the nodal points, the choke points, major marshalling yards, critical viaducts, and the few complex switch points where the entirety of the north-south traffic bottlenecked. One intelligence officer, a former civil engineer, famously described the Italian rail network in a briefing. Imagine a rope woven from 1,000 threads. We will not cut every thread. We will find the point where they all pass through a single narrow pulley, and we will strike that pulley with a hammer. The air crews, mostly young men from the American Midwest, found the Italian missions a stark contrast to the grim, freezing horror of raids over Germany. The weather was often clearer, the flak, initially, was lighter. They saw the dazzling blue of the Mediterranean below, a beauty that contrasted violently with the destructive terror they were bringing. Then came the new orders. Rome. On the morning of July 19th, over 500 American bombers, protected by P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts, streaked toward the Eternal City. They were not targeting the Vatican or the Colosseum. Their target was the San Lorenzo marshalling yard and the Ciampino airfield. In the Italian capital, life had maintained a nervous veneer of normalcy. Mussolini had repeatedly assured the king, the pope, and the fearful populace that Rome was inviolable. This was the city of Caesar, the birthplace of civilization, guarded by history and global consensus. That fragile illusion was shattered at 11:00 a.m. The deep, resonant drone of hundreds of four-engined American giants was not like the ragged, nocturnal thrum of a few British Lancasters. It was a physical sound, a thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath the city's ancient foundations. From the cockpit of a B-17, the target looked like a complex toy train set, easily distinguishable from the surrounding city. But to the Italian citizens nearby, caught in the swirling dust and noise, it was simply hell descending. The first waves dropped high-explosive bombs, tearing through the rails, flipping locomotives, and detonating ammunition cars. The subsequent waves followed with incendiaries, turning the wrecked yard into a molten inferno. A young Italian signalman, caught in the chaos, would later recall, "We heard the high-pitched whistle, not of a train, but of the bombs falling. I saw the rails rise up like angry snakes, then the ground split open. My entire world became dirt, fire, and the smell of hot, burning iron. The promise of the Deuce that Rome was safe, it turned into ash right there. The political repercussions were instantaneous and cataclysmic. The bombing of Rome, a city considered sacred, was the ultimate psychological shockwave. It was proof that the Axis was no longer capable of protecting even its core. The very next day, Benito Mussolini, deeply shaken and politically isolated, met with Hitler to beg for fighter support, a request that was coldly denied. The fuse had been lit. The heavy bomb loads did not just destroy a rail yard, they destroyed the collective belief in the fascist regime. The strategic interdiction campaign had begun not with a whimper, but with the loudest possible crash, signaling to the world and to the despairing Italian people that the rules of the war in the Mediterranean had just been permanently rewritten. The story of Italy's collapse in 1943 is not just one of bombs, but of a brilliant, brutal technological strategy that targeted the very nerves and arteries of a nation. If you found the beginning of this historical journey compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us dive deeper into the untold stories of technology and warfare that shaped the modern world. The attack on Rome was the opening salvo, a political earthquake that quickly resulted in the deposition and arrest of Mussolini just 6 days later. But the war machine of the Axis, now led by the pragmatic and brutal German command under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, did not stop. German forces flooded across the Alps in a pre-planned operation, effectively occupying their former ally. The supply problem now shifted. It was no longer about starving Italy, but about crippling the ability of the Wehrmacht to sustain the defense of the peninsula against the oncoming Allied ground forces. The campaign moved into its critical phase, the calculated strangulation of the German-held Italian supply lines. This was a battle won not by ground troops, but by engineers, analysts, and pilots, a war of math and metallurgy waged from 25,000 feet. The core technology of this interdiction was the sheer industrial output of the United States, manifested in the sheer scale of the bomb load. The Allies were able to dedicate massive resources to the task. By late 1943, the combined British and American air effort in the Mediterranean could sustain a relentless day and night campaign. The tactical doctrine shifted to a method dubbed the chain of obstruction. Sir Solly Zuckerman, a British scientist and chief air planning officer, championed the idea that rather than trying to destroy all rail cars or all tracks, the most efficient method was to identify the few points whose destruction would cause the maximum cascading failure. This meant attacking bridges, viaducts over deep gorges, and the entrances to tunnels, targets that were difficult to repair and often impossible to bypass quickly. Consider the viaducts and bridges of the Apennine Mountains. The Italian railway system, due to the unforgiving terrain, was riddled with engineering marvels. A single critical viaduct might carry the rail line high above a valley for hundreds of feet. The B-17s, flying in their tight, self-defending combat boxes, would aim for the center pylons. The bombers were equipped with the Norden bombsight, a notoriously complex piece of analog computing designed for pickle-barrel accuracy, though in practice its performance was often inconsistent under combat conditions. The sheer volume of bombs dropped, however, compensated for precision. We were told we weren't hitting a bridge, we were hitting a clock. Knock out the mainspring, and the whole mechanism stops. When a B-24 load hit a viaduct, the destruction wasn't just physical, it was temporal. It took them 3 weeks to build a temporary crossing. That's 3 weeks of starvation for the German units at the front. Excerpt from the memoirs of a US Air Corps bombardier. The German response was immediate and desperate. Flak anti-aircraft artillery became dense, heavy, and lethal. The notorious German 88mm guns ringed every key bridge and marshalling yard, creating a deadly steel curtain at altitude. The skies over Naples and Foggia became a gauntlet. German engineers, masters of improvisation, developed counter-interdiction techniques. They kept repair gangs ready 24/7, stocked with prefabricated wooden and steel bridge sections. They also built diversions, temporary rail loops that snaked around a cratered area. But the sheer tempo of the Allied bombardment was overwhelming. In the 3 months following the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, in July 1943, the rate of rail line destruction skyrocketed. The key rail lines to the south were not just damaged, they were systematically pulverized. The numbers tell the story of a system in collapse. Before interdiction, early 1943, hundreds of rail cars of supplies moving south daily. Post-interdiction, September-October 1943. Traffic reduced by an estimated 90% on critical lines supplying German forward positions. The flow of fuel, ammunition and replacement parts slowed to a crippling trickle. The German and Italian soldiers at the front, now relying on the dwindling stockpiles, began to feel the pinch. No more replacements for the worn-out truck tires, fewer shells for the heavy artillery. A critical decline in the fuel necessary for the rapid deployment of their formidable armored divisions. The irony was not lost on the pilots. They were flying highly technical missions, dropping hundreds of tons of metal and explosive. Yet their targets were the most basic elements of infrastructure. They were starving an army not with siege, but with engineering precision from the air. It was a cold, calculated victory for technological warfare, but it carried a heavy human cost. The relentless bombing also caused immense collateral damage. As the Allies became less discriminating in their pursuit of critical targets, entire neighborhoods near rail centers were obliterated, transforming the strategic air war into a humanitarian crisis. The supply lines were collapsing, but the foundation of Italian society was fracturing right along with them. The Wehrmacht knew they were in a race against time, desperately moving vital supplies by road, a slower, more vulnerable method that would soon become the focus of the next brutal act of the interdiction campaign. The collapse of the rail system was complete, and the stage was set for the nightmare of the German retreat. The fall of the rail network forced Field Marshal Kesselring's hand. The German defense of Italy could not be maintained without an alternative supply route. The result was a dramatic and dangerous pivot: the Road War. Kesselring ordered the mobilization of all available transport. Convoys of German trucks, often captured or requisitioned Italian civilian vehicles, loaded with precious fuel drums, cases of artillery shells, and tins of food, began to crawl down the few treacherous mountain roads. The efficiency of the rail system, which could move hundreds of tons of cargo simultaneously, was replaced by the grinding, slow vulnerability of convoys. The shift was a gift to the Allied air forces. The American heavy bombers were now joined by their tactical ground attack cousins, the P-40 Warhawk, the A-20 Havoc, and most crucially, the ubiquitous P-47 Thunderbolt, the Juggernaut. The P-47, initially derided as too heavy and complex, had come into its own as a devastating close-air support and interdiction aircraft. Equipped with 8 50-caliber machine guns, the Thunderbolt was a flying tank, capable of shrugging off ground fire while delivering a shocking volume of lead. The pilots called these missions armed reconnaissance, but to the German soldiers on the road, it was a sudden, violent ambush from the sky. The pilots flew low, hugging the terrain, looking for the telltale plume of dust that signaled a convoy. We were driving the truck through a narrow, winding pass near the coast. It was slow going. Suddenly, a shadow. The roar wasn't above us, it was right next to us. Then the air started to tear apart. It wasn't just noise, it was the sound of 1,000 hammers hitting steel. I saw the tracer rounds walking right up the column, exploding vehicles like popcorn. We abandoned the truck and ran for the drainage ditch. That American pilot didn't stop until every vehicle was either burning or shot to pieces. We lost everything. Testimony of Heinrich Voss, Wehrmacht transport driver, 1943. The psychological impact of this air-to-ground interdiction was profound. The German soldier in Italy could no longer trust the roads. Every vehicle was a potential target, every journey a terrifying game of chance. The supply convoys were forced to move primarily at night, further slowing delivery, or to utilize routes so minor and remote they were barely fit for military traffic, increasing wear and tear on already stressed vehicles. The human cost began to mount far away from the front lines. The constant bombing shattered the infrastructure of Italian daily life. Refugees clogged the roads, adding to the logistical nightmare and complicating the air attacks. Water, food, and medical supplies, non-existent for the German troops, also evaporated for the civilian population in the contested zones. In October 1943, the port of Naples stands as a testament to the brutal success of interdiction. The Germans, in their retreat and before the city's liberation, implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying all essential services. But even before that, The relentless Allied bombing of the port and the surrounding rail links had turned this vital hub into a ghost of its former self. Dockyards, once bustling with supply ships, were choked with sunken vessels and pulverized quays. The German army's defensive strategy now relied less on maneuver and more on fortified lines, the Winter Line and the formidable Gustav Line. They utilized the mountainous terrain of the peninsula, turning every ridge and gorge into a defensive strongpoint. This shift was a direct consequence of the shattered supply lines. If they couldn't move supplies rapidly for an offensive, they had to dig in and force the Allies to come to them, where a small unit could hold off a division. Kesselring, a master of defensive warfare, had managed to salvage a defense, but at a terrible price. He was sustaining a protracted battle on a shoestring budget of logistics, a concept unheard of for the Wehrmacht in the early years of the war. The Allies, meanwhile, learned the hard lesson that tactical success from the air did not guarantee an easy victory on the ground. The collapse of the supply lines created a desperate, resourceful enemy. The next chapter would pit the industrial might of the American heavy bomb loads against the ultimate defensive bastion, the line that was supposed to hold until spring. The ground campaign stalled. By late 1943, the Allied armies, clawing their way up the Italian peninsula, faced the unforgiving reality of the Gustav Line, a complex network of fortifications, bunkers, and anti-tank positions stretching across the narrowest point of Italy. It was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, anchored by the formidable peaks of the Apennines and the symbolic, heartbreaking bulk of Monte Cassino. This was the climax of the interdiction strategy. The Allied air campaign had successfully destroyed the flow of supplies, but the German troops holding the Gustav Line were now fighting a war of attrition, sustained by meager, localized logistics. The question became a test of wills. Could the collapsed supply lines force a decisive collapse of the German defense, or would the Germans' mastery of the defensive hold long enough to bleed the Allies dry? The heavy bombers, the same B-17s and B-24s that had pulverized rail yards, were now tasked with the ultimate challenge, softening the most heavily defended ground positions in Italy. Air commanders argued fiercely. Should they target the fortifications directly, providing tactical support, or continue the relentless attacks on the supply nodes behind the line, ensuring that any German reinforcement was utterly impossible? The ultimate strategic doctrine won out. The decision was made to continue the strangulation. The 15th Air Force focused their heaviest efforts not on the immediate front line, but hundreds of miles to the north, targeting the key rail junction at Verona and the mountain passes leading to the Brenner Pass. The objective was to create a zone of such total, inescapable destruction that Field Marshal Kesselring could not even contemplate a large-scale offensive or, crucially, a smooth, orderly retreat. This was the strategic doctrine of turning the screw, grinding the German war machine into total operational paralysis. The German logistics officer responsible for the sector, Colonel General Hans Valentin Hube, described the reality in a grim memo. The greatest enemy is not the attacking infantry, but the absence of replacement parts. Our tanks stand idle for weeks awaiting tracks. Our trucks are cannibalized for a single spare tire. We are fighting a war against the American factory, and we are losing that battle 1 kilometer of destroyed rail line at a time. The terror was constant. The German forward troops, entrenched in the mountains, had to brave the air-supplied chaos just to get a hot meal. Mules and men, a supply method unthinkable for a modern army, carried ammunition over impossible terrain, a stark contrast to the vast mechanized logistics of the Allied forces. The supply collapse was turning the German army in Italy from a mobile, aggressive force into a static, beleaguered garrison desperately clinging to defensive positions. Yet the Allied ground forces found the defensive line to be a near impassable wall. The success of the air campaign, in a twisted irony, only made the remaining German resistance more desperate, more fanatical. The destruction of the supply lines had not eliminated the German soldiers' will to fight. It had hardened it. They knew retreat meant starvation, so they fought for every inch. This led directly to the most controversial and tragically miscalculated decision of the Italian campaign, the bombing of Monte Cassino in February 1944. By early 1944, the 4 initial assaults on the Gustav Line had failed. Allied morale was sinking, commanders, seeking any advantage, focused on the ancient Benedictine abbey. Though historical evidence suggested the abbey itself was not directly occupied by German troops, the belief was widespread that German observers were using the heights for artillery spotting. The strategic air war, born of technical precision, was about to be leveraged for a purely tactical yet politically and morally explosive result. On February 15, 1944, the sky above the Liri Valley filled with the thunder of over 220 Allied bombers, a mix of B-17s, B-25s and B-26s. They dropped over 1,400 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs, turning the 6th century abbey into a rubble-strewn mountain of dust. The intention was to clear the hill. The result was a catastrophic, tragic irony. The ruins provided the German paratroopers, the tough Fallschirmjäger, with perfect, virtually indestructible defensive positions, vastly improving their ability to resist. The massive strategic bomb load had been used tactically, failing to achieve its objective and handing the German propaganda machine a monumental victory. The ultimate price of total interdiction was a complex moral and strategic calculation. The bombing had successfully shattered the enemy's ability to fight a modern motorized war, but it had not shattered their spirit. It was a stalemate of logistics versus will. The true victory of the interdiction campaign was not the destruction of Cassino, but the slow, agonizing, continuous starvation of the German forces after the battle. By May 1944, when Operation Diadem finally broke the Gustav Line, the German defense was not merely repelled, it was exhausted. The defending divisions were critically low on fuel, severely lacking in ammunition reserves, and utterly unable to launch a rapid, sustained counterattack that might have turned the tide. The collapsed supply lines had turned a planned German defense into a disorganized, desperate fighting retreat. The bomb loads, dropped months earlier on distant rail lines, had paved the way for the liberation of Rome, forcing the German army to fight with the equivalent of sticks and stones against the Allies' relentless machine of armor and infantry. The strategic investment in destruction had finally paid its bloody dividend. By the time the Allies entered Rome in June 1944, the fate of the Italian campaign had been sealed not in a single heroic charge, but in 1,000 craters along a rail line and 1,000,000 rounds of .50 caliber fire on remote mountain roads. The collapse of the Italian supply lines in 1943 was more than just a military success. It was a profound case study in the devastating systemic potential of strategic air power when applied to a brittle logistical system. The legacy of the heavy bomb loads of 1943 is multi-layered, extending far beyond the Italian peninsula. For the Axis, the interdiction campaign dramatically accelerated the Italian surrender and transformed the German presence in Italy into a continuous, exhausting battle for survival. It forced the Wehrmacht to divert over 20 divisions, approximately a fifth of its entire army, to defend a secondary front merely to hold territory and secure a retreat. These were divisions that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet counteroffensives were beginning to take their toll, or for the coming defense of France against the inevitable cross-channel invasion. The supply collapse in Italy was, therefore, a strategic victory with global impact, contributing significantly to the overall resource drain on the Nazi war effort. The German doctrine had been shattered. They realized that total air superiority over the battlefield meant that their logistics, the unglamorous, indispensable core of any modern army, could be neutralized with surgical precision. This forced them to develop deeply concealed, decentralized supply dumps and rely more heavily on horse-drawn and even human transport, a humiliating logistical regression to Napoleonic warfare. The vast infrastructure that Hitler had built his war upon was revealed to be tragically vulnerable from above. For the Allies, the campaign proved the efficacy of choke point targeting, a strategy that would be perfected in the coming months over Germany itself. The success in Italy was not just a one-off victory, but a crucial blueprint for the later, massive transportation plan that crippled the German infrastructure in Northwest Europe prior to D-Day. The industrial capacity of the United States, the ability to produce thousands of heavy bombers and the millions of tons of ordnance they carried, was the ultimate, unanswerable weapon, the true arsenal of democracy in action. However, the cost was not insignificant. Thousands of Allied airmen were lost to the fierce German flak and fighter defenses defending the supply routes. Furthermore, the deliberate targeting of infrastructure within a civilian-populated country resulted in an estimated 60,000 to 70,000 Italian civilian deaths throughout the war, many of them caused by the heavy bomber raids of 1943 and 1944. The line between a military target and a civilian dwelling, especially in dense urban centers containing marshalling yards, became tragically blurred. We were fighting for our survival, but what we were doing to the Italian people, it was difficult to reconcile. You'd see the fires from 20,000 feet, and you knew you'd hit the target, but you also knew what was burning below that was not just a train. That's a weight you carry home. Reminiscence of a B-24 pilot, post-war interview. The Italian peninsula became a laboratory for logistics warfare, demonstrating that an enemy could be defeated not by the destruction of their armies in pitched battle, but by the systematic dismantling of the entire support structure that allowed those armies to move, shoot, and eat. It was a victory of system over savagery. The final potent irony of the Italian campaign lies in the fact that the complete logistical collapse that was meant to produce a swift, clean victory, the knockout punch, instead resulted in one of the longest, bloodiest, and most grueling campaigns of the Western Front. It was a testament to the sheer resilience and desperate fighting spirit of the German soldier. Yet by forcing that soldier to fight without fuel, without food, and without hope of reinforcement, the heavy bomb loads of the 15th Air Force ultimately predetermined the result. The victory may have been slow, measured in agonizing inches of territory, but it was inevitable. The arterial network of Italy was severed, and the German war effort was left to slowly bleed out in the mountains. The collapse of the supply lines was the invisible dagger thrust into the heart of Mussolini's regime, and the debilitating wound for Kesselring's defense, a chapter of the war written not by heroes on the ground, but by the cold, devastating calculations of men operating miles above the fray. The stories of technology, strategy, and human struggle in World War II are endless. If you wish to uncover more narratives of incredible technological achievements and strategic turning points like this one, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. Let us know in the comments below which technological battleground you want us to explore next.